Welcome to the first in this academic year's series of Leeds Cultural Conversations. I'm Professor Susan Watkins, Director of the Centre for Culture and the Arts at Leeds Beckett. This is the fourth year we've been running these talks in partnership with the City Council and the humanities publisher Palgrave Macmillan. Each talk is an opportunity for you to find out about our current research and let us know what you think. So all feedback's welcome. This year we start the series with a talk from Dr. Catherine Harrison, who's course director for our English and Media degree at Leeds Beckett University, and Dr. Cassie Ogden from Liverpool John Moores University. Catherine is a cultural researcher with particular interest in visual culture and feminism. Her current research focuses on the following areas: women and craft, stigma and space, hoodie horror, which sounds interesting to me, and nuclear images, especially of the mushroom cloud in contemporary culture. Cassie Ogden is a senior lecturer in sociology at Liverpool John Moores University. Her research interests include critical disability studies, the sociology of the body and health and illness, and feminism and domestic culture. Cassie has published and co-published on disability hate crime, childhood illness experiences, and the social and legal responses to smoking in public, as well as the use of food banks in Cheshire. So their talk today, which is about their joint research project, is called Stitch and Bitch: Knitting, Femininity and Women's Everyday Lives. So welcome to you all. Thanks.
Thank you very much everyone for coming today and for bearing with us while we got the technical problems sorted out, and thank you very much to Susan for inviting us to share our research. I'd just like to, looking at this screen, look this way. I'd just like to sort of give a disclaimer about the title of our talk. We've called it Stitch and Bitch, and for those of you who don't know, the Stitch and Bitch group is a knitting group. Usually it takes place in a public place, maybe a cafe, a shopping mall, a pub or something like that. And it's where knitters get together and talk, bitch and stitch. But as we're going to talk about today, our participants really hated the term stitch and bitch. Some people are nodding, right? Yeah. And they preferred the term knit and natter. Yeah? Makes sense. But we thought stitch and bitch would draw more of you in to come to life. It sounded more controversial. So it should really be called knit and natter. Anyway, the background to the research is in about 2014, 2015, Cassie and I have noticed, a bit lately actually, that knitting had undergone something of a resurgence in popularity. And we thought that we'd like to investigate this and find out more about what was going on. So we've done a research project, and the research project is both textual, so we've looked at representations of the knitter in the 21st century, looking at popular media and popular culture, but it was also empirical in that we sat down with knitters in focus groups and talked to them about their experiences and perceptions of knitting. And our research generated a lot of interesting findings, but I think the most interesting thing for us was that the reinvention of knitting in the 21st century seems to have been a bit at the expense of older female knitters. So older female knitters have been marginalised, we think, in the way that knitting is now talked about in the 21st century. Nevertheless, they have a lot of interesting things to tell us about knitting, and we're going to talk about both aspects of the study today. Now, is this working? I'll do the arrow. Yes. So I'd like to start off with a quotation, and this is from a leisure sociologist called Mary Beth C. Stalp, and she identifies that textile handicrafts are neglected within sociology and leisure research. So she says, quite handily for us, that well-intentioned, intelligent and reasonable scholars in numerous disciplines tend to overlook that sewing and other textile handicrafts, such as knitting, can be worthy of study. There are still some taboo topics in academia. So for Stout, she thinks that the study of knitting is a taboo. And I think Cassie and I would concur with that. So at the institution where we both used to work, not here, some of our colleagues openly laughed at us when we said we were going to do research with knitters. We were derided, frankly. And when we present this research at conferences, we often get put in really odd panels, like last thing on a Friday afternoon, with some sort of odds and sods topics that don't seem to have any, any similarity with what we're doing. And all I'd say about that is this does not happen to leisure that is enjoyed by men. So football doesn't get relegated to the 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. So I think that's an interesting place to begin. So today we're going to talk about why study knitters. If they're not being studied, why should we study them? I'm going to say a really short section about knitting in feminist thought, and then we're going to describe to you what new knitting is like in the 21st century, or at least how it's represented to us. We're then going to talk about granny knitters. This is a term that's come out of the research rather than necessarily our term. And then we're going to talk about our research project, how we designed the research, what we found out, and hopefully we'll come to some sort of intelligent conclusion, but we'll see. All right, so why study knitters then? Well, since about 2008, 2009, it's been recorded that knitting has undergone a huge resurgence in popularity. So it's estimated that in Britain, about 11% of the population knits, and that's about 7.3 million people. At least 5.9 million of these knitters are thought to be women, and it's very difficult to find out what ages these knitters might be. But by looking at market research, we've discovered that the 18 to 34-year-old age group is seen as a growth area for manufacturers of knitting products and yarn. Now, we read that then, that means that therefore the vast majority of knitters, the sort of market base for buying knitting products in Britain, is age 35 and over. So that's the sort of basis we're working on. The Knitters social network, Ravelry.com, has over 8 million members worldwide. And every time I check that site, the numbers have gone up hugely. So people are still joining this on a daily basis. And if you log in, there are thousands of people active on the site at any one time. Yarn shops have returned to the British High Street, but they've been reimagined now as quite trendy social spaces. So they serve coffee or have film nights and things like that in them. And knitting has become visible, and it's visible in this room today, which is very nice. So people are now knitting in public, in cafes, in shops, public transport, libraries. They're knitting festivals. Knitting appears in advertising campaigns, and so on. It's a highly visible leisure practice. Despite this, there's very little academic research on knitting. There is some, but it tends to be confined to either sort of textiles-based research, or if it is sociological, it focuses on young knitters. So there's a particular slant to the research that we've encountered. Other research, the stuff about who knits, where they knit, and so on, is dominated by commercial interests. So the yarn industry, people who make knitting products and want to sell it to us. So we think there's a gap where academic research, sociological academic research is needed to see what knitters are up to. Okay. So, I'm really briefly going to talk about the role of knitting, or the place of knitting in feminist thought. And it's true that knitting and other textile handicrafts have got a really contentious position in feminist thinking, second-wave feminist thinking at least. For writers like Betty Friedan and Anne Oakley, anything related to housewifery is associated with domestic drudgery and patriarchal oppression of women. So knitting is very much linked to the domestic sphere, the space of the home, which second-wave feminists wanted to escape from. So the home is represented as seen as a place of confinement, and women should get out into the public realm and have jobs in the masculine realm. And it's not a straightforward consequence, but part of this way of thinking has led to dismissive stereotypes of the, quote, granny knitter, the sort of older lady who's represented as passive, domestic, benign, confined to the home, and representative of women's past, not the future that the modern young woman is representing. And I think this had some influence in the late 20th century. Knitting seemed to fall out of popularity. It wasn't something that was seen as a modern young woman's pastime. Okay. And this is summed up quite nicely by Jemaine Greer, the famous second-wave feminist who never pulls her punches. She said in The Guardian in 2007, "Women have frittered their lives away, stitching things for which there is no demand, ever since vicarious leisure was invented. For centuries, women have been kept busy, wasting their time." All right. And I think this idea about knitting still continues today. So if anybody's been watching the adaptation of Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale, in the second series, which just has finished, you might have noticed that the character Mrs. Waterford, Serena, often knits, but she knits in a way that is meant to show that she's been excluded from the public realm. So the more she's denied a political voice in the political world of Gilead, the more she's confined to the home, the more she knits. This is angry knitting. If you can see her face, she's not enjoying this knitting at all. And it's also interesting when you watch the show that she only ever uses like murky coloured yarns, grey or beige colours. Even though everyone wears red and sort of turquoise, she just knits in these muddy colours. Who knows what she's making? All right. On the other hand, knitting has got an alternative story. So textile handicrafts have long been part and parcel of feminist activism. So from things like Green and Common in the 1980s, when knitting and other textile handicrafts were part of the women's peace camps, up until the present day with the Pussycats Project, which took place in 2017 and 2018 as part of the women's marches. And this is where women across the world, but particularly in Washington DC, gathered to protest against Donald Trump's misogynistic comments about grabbing women by the pussy. And people knitted these hats. You can see an example on the screen there. And thousands of women went to the women's marches wearing these as a sign of their dissent. Okay. So there's a couple of things really to say about textile handicrafts in feminist thought, and it's really that it occupies an ambiguous position. So I've got a quotation here from a writer called Rosika Parker, who's written about embroidery sewing. She doesn't really write about knitting, but I think there's a similarity. And she says, "Embroidery has provided a source of pleasure and power for women, while being indissolubly linked to their powerlessness." So knitting is both things at once. It's linked to passivity, confinement to the domestic sphere, women's exclusion from public life, but also it's a source of pleasure, power, creativity for women. And some writers called Johnson and Lloyd also sum this up nicely, where they say the project of feminism has been built on this tradition of domesticity as a source of critique of the contemporary social world. So they argue that we can look at the domestic and use it to understand women's position in the wider social world. It's an interesting thing to look at. It can teach us a lot. All right. So, to the present day then, a few words about 21st century knitting. Up until about 2008, 2009, knitting was still associated with this old grandma passive image. A writer called Drix has said it was still relegated to the realm of stuffy postmenopausal wife. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but in 2007 there was a Shreddies advertising campaign that featured the knitting nanas, old ladies with blue rinsed hair, wearing a twin set and pearls, and the conceit of the advertisement is that they knit the Shreddies, they knit the shredded wheat, and there's a bit of banter between them, but they're just very typical granny sort of images. So the idea is that this represented what people thought about knitting in 2007. But after 2007, or around the same time, crafting, it underwent a huge revival. Not just knitting and not just textile handicrafts, but also things like micro-brewing, terrarium gardening, even taxidermy has been on the up. So crafting became something different, something new, something done by hipsters, by young people. So by 2009, it was argued that knitting was the new clubbing. And this has been called the new knitting. So the new knitting is different from the old knitting. So Cassie and I have looked at the way that the new knitting has been represented in popular media and popular culture, and in the way that we sort of think about knitting today. And we've identified three themes. Firstly, new knitting is youthful. It's represented as exceptionally young. And, would you believe, it's sexy? And we'll say a few things about that in a minute. New knitting is represented as connected. It's something that's done publicly, and it's to do with socialising and getting together on and offline. And finally, new knitting is woke. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this word or not. It's a word that was added to the Oxford English Dictionary just in 2017. And basically it means politically conscious. So a lot of supermodels at the moment and pop stars describe themselves as woke or having wokeness. And it basically means they're alert to social justice and they want us to know about it via Instagram. So it's political consciousness, but with a large element of sort of showing off and maybe doing things for symbolic reasons rather than actual social change. All right. So I'm going to rattle through these quite quickly. So knitting, new knitting is young, hip and sexy. At the bottom on the screen there, I hope you can see there's some images that relate to pattern books that have been published in recent years. One of my favourites is Naughty Needles, Sexy Saucy Knits for the Bedroom and Beyond. Yeah, you might well grimace. This book, I was going to bring it today and I forgot. It contains patterns for condom critters. I'll let you think about that. An S&M straight jacket. There are socks that describe as Kinderhore socks. I'm sorry, you didn't expect this to talk about knitting. And a lot of patterns for lingerie, quite sexy lingerie, nurses' outfits and things like that. Knitting is also represented as youthful. So the popular internet meme featuring the Hollywood actor Ryan Gosling, the Hey Girl meme, often featured knitting things. So the idea is people share this image of Ryan Gosling, and it always started off, hey girl, and in this one I've put on the screen, it's I can teach you how to knit. So it's sort of, there's sexual overtones about this kind of knitting. And men's knitting ties in with this as well, but we've not got time to talk about that. Knitting's also, new knitting I should say, is connected. So a big feature of new knitting is knitting in groups, in public places. Cafes, pubs, public transport, town squares, things like that. But the connectedness also takes place online. So I've already mentioned Ravelry, the Facebook of knitting as it's been described. But there's a lot of knitting activity as well on Instagram and Pinterest and other kind of internet forums. So part of the new knitting is showing off your knitting. New knitting is something one is seen to be doing in public. Finally, knitting is woke. This also involves a lot of knitted vaginas. So not only the Pussycats Project in 2017-2018, but a lot of knitting groups have been involved in knitting for political reasons or awareness raising for things like female genital mutilation, and they've chosen to knit things, knit vagina quilts, or as you can see, hopefully, the website from the Shoreditch Sisters Women's Institute here, they were knitting vulvas and putting these together as part of a quilt. Now, I don't want to disparage this kind of piece of activism. Knitting and textile handicrafts are obviously really important to women's political expression and their occupation in a feminine way of the public realm. But we've got question marks about the idea of representing women's human rights as a vagina. There seems to be something reductive about that recalls sort of biological essentialism, reverting women just to being a vagina. So we've got some question marks about that. All right. Now, in relation to this idea of the new knitting as young and sexy, connected and woke, we've seen a lot of news articles published, and they always invariably have headlines like the ones you can see on the screen. Knitting, not just for grannies. Not your grandma's knitting circle. Not your grandma's crochet. Grandma never knit like this. So it seems that part of the reinvention of new knitting is the repudiation of older women's knitting. Grannies are being evoked only to be dismissed as that they are not part of this new knitting scene. So the reinvention of knitting is at the expense of older women. Knitting is cool, so older women are the antithesis of cool. And this has been described by a writer called Joanne Turney as saying that the granny knitters are a highly gendered relic from yesteryear. They represent the past. They're what women used to be. They don't have any relevance today. But this creates a huge problem because, as we've seen, the the vast majority of knitters in Britain are women aged 35 or over. So it's 5.9 million women who could be conceived with a stretch of the imagination as grandmas, are people who are actually doing the knitting. And we wanted to find out what those women thought. This is just a screen grab of an advertorial email I received recently from ASOS.com, the online fashion retailer. And I'm sorry if it's a bit small on the screen, but it says that we're taking our autumn-winter style notes from stylish nanas everywhere with this mashup of cute knits, dresses and block-heeled shoes. So far so good, right? Grandmas are a style inspiration. But then, fresh hanky up the sleeve optional. So luckily it's a fresh hanky, but old ladies are being represented as a bit runny, aren't they? A bit icky. There's something revolting about the way that nanas are being recalled in relation to knitwear. Now, how does this affect older female knitters? Well, Cassie's going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. But we found an interesting case that was reported in the newspapers quite recently, and it was to do with a supposed dispute in the Women's Institute. This was magnified, I think, for entertainment value by the press. But basically, the president of Hastings and Orr, WI, a lady called Stephanie Gaunt, had taken umbrage at what she called the radical knitting activities of a younger WI branch, the Shoreditch sisters, who we already saw as these vulva knitting hipsters. And she said, modern cool hipster knitting seems to be about knitting for protest. They're proud of knitting a solidarity blanket for the refugee women in Yarl's Wood Detention Centre. Is this any more commendable or interesting than the thousands upon thousands of WI women who quietly get on with knitting clothes for premature babies, twiddle muffs for dementia patients, daffodils for Marie Curie cancer care, toys to sell to benefit their chosen local charities and so on? Thinking about it, what would us lot in Hastings knit for these unfortunate women in Yarl's Wood? Practical things, hats, scarves, mittens. So this is one account of the way that older knitters are feeling marginalised by the new reinvention of knitting as youthful, woke and connected.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the empirical side of our research, what happened when we actually talked to the knitters and how we talked to the knitters too. So we start off with our research question, having researched all the things that Catherine talked to you about today. We needed basically to find out what contemporary knitters are doing and what they feel about their own and other people's knitting. We needed to get social sciences back to thinking about knitting as a real worthwhile academic subject. But as Catherine has already explained in part, when we came to our colleagues in our past institution and said to them, we really want to explore knitters and knitting, we were kind of met with much hilarity. We became the subject of hilarity. I'm sure we were talked about high up in that university, and knitting in the academy we soon came to find was derided in the same way it's derided in many media outlets too. So when it came to a methodology, we really needed to think carefully about how we can welcome knitters to the academy and protect them, if you like, from this kind of idea that we can make fun of knitting. We need to make sure that the academy and universities are open to and value kind of knitters and their knitting. So how can we construct a method that was inclusive and was welcoming to knitters? Well, at the time, our past institution that we both worked at held a teaching conference. So we thought that this university teaching conference would be a good platform on which to pilot a method that we could use in our main study. So we gave the opportunity for participants to come along and hear about our research, but within that as well, we allowed them to, we invited them to bring along their knitting. And for the first time ever, in the university's history of the teaching conference, that's what I like to say anyway, it was sold out in 10 minutes like flat. So we thought, right, we're on to something here. And it seems to be welcoming. Saying that you can bring along your knitting, maybe that's a thing that welcomes people too. So we supplied the knitting materials and we cast on a line for when they came. That was bad because we can knit, but we're quite rubbish knitters, I think it's fair to say, sort of like, oh, they've done this too loose, so we did that. And the idea was to use the product of individuals knitting to basically yarn bomb the academy afterwards, because it's kind of putting knitting in the face of the institution and the academy, right? And we, unfortunately, this didn't mean that we adorned balaclavas in the middle of the night and then kind of put our yarn bomb in somewhere in the institution. We worked there and we needed to abide by health and safety rules, so it's quite a laborious process as to choose where to put this yarn bomb. So we took the little bits of material that people had knitted, we sewed it together, and we chose a railing that was up on the first floor of the Social Sciences department to install the knitting. We felt that the positioning of this kind of challenged the academy and invited people to talk about knitting and share their experiences in a space of patriarchal dominance. And again, it made us think about that we needed to ensure that our research didn't reproduce the problematic power relations that traditional research methods carried with them. So we thought the actual pilot study that brought people together knitting, almost like a knitting circle, whilst listening to our academic, all it was reading then, worked really well. It opened discussions up and people seemed to enjoy being there, discussing things academically whilst also knitting. So we decided to adopt that in our main part. When we looked at the methodological merits of this, other people have already talked about at length the importance of creativity in academic methods. So Gauntlet uses creative practices within his work all the time. He tells us that art making and creative play could lead to an uninhabited state during which meaningful material would surface. So he's basically saying here that if someone is engaged in something they enjoy, a creative pursuit, then it will open up their minds and, as he says in another statement, reveal different kinds of accounts and give us a fuller understanding of those subjectivities. So in basic forms, my interpretation of that, it makes people feel relaxed, so they're more likely to open up and talk about things. So we thought introducing knitting circles into our research would benefit us as researchers, but also, and importantly, allow knitters to enjoy the experience of being part of research and feel included. So that's what we did in our main study. We used the knitting circle. And now we had this issue of trying to reach all sorts of knitters. We've been told kind of contradictory information about who knitters are in the 21st century. On the one hand, we had the traditional consumer base of knitters, older knitters, and then we had this new radical kind of knitters. So we decided to advertise in a range of different ways on Ravelry.com, in supermarkets, leisure centres, and we used the university staff mailing list when we held a focus group in Chester. So our focus groups took place in different parts of the country. We had Chester, Manchester and Wrexham, which is situated in North Wales. You might detect my accent from there as well. So we wanted to be quite broad with the inclusion criteria. Eligible participants was basically they only had to be knitting for at least 6 months, but they had a basic level of proficiency. We thought the fact that people would stand forward and take part in our research at all would suggest that they're into knitting. It's not just like 6 months of casual knitting and they're not liking it that much. So we just made the inclusion criteria quite open, with the hope that we would get a range of different knitters coming to us. We adopted a short questionnaire just to collect people's demographic data and their knitting history. And our focus groups or knitting circles took about 90 minutes per group. They consisted of 3 to 6 participants in each of those groups. And we used something called thematic analysis to establish the key themes. More about that in a minute. So, out of 3 focus groups, we recruited 15 participants. As you can see there, there was not many male knitters, so as part of what Catherine was telling me, like the new knitters are meant to be male knitters there, and we tried to be broad as we could in our inclusion criteria. The people who came forward were primarily female and one identifying as gender neutral. Despite our interest in older women's knitting, we did not at any stage stipulate any age or gender limitations. So it's interesting to see who we ended up with, if you like. I mean that in the nicest possible sense. So no men attended. There was a nice mix of age ranges there. So 5 were under 35 and 10 participants were 35 years or above. Catherine again has already explained why we've used that as a criteria of defining younger knitters, the ways that consumer market have tried to generate new knitters to the craft, and then the older knitters 35 and above. All our other participants were white British or white other. Through our demographic kind of questionnaire, we found out that the average age that the participants learnt to knit was 8.7 years, and every single one of them had learned from a female member of their family. We'll come back to that in one of our themes later. So what was the overall finding first? Well, we were waiting for the political knitter, we were waiting for the stereotypical granny knitter, and we almost expected there to be a war between the two. I don't know what we expected there to be. But what we found was not a direct kind of characteristic of either of them two things. We've come up with the term the everyday knitter to describe the kind of participants that our study tended to collect. So they didn't fit neatly into any of these common discursive constructions of the knitter. Firstly, the majority of them were professionals. When we look at the discourse of the granny knitter, it's expected that they are in some way non-professional, that we can mock and deride them. There was varied ages, as we've said. Many were sceptical about public knitting, we'll come back to that. Now the majority were networked online, but there were several abstainers, so even older knitters were networked online, but perhaps in different ways that we might have expected. Several knitted for charitable reasons, but there were no overtly political knitters, even the younger ones. No participants knitted for profit, so they didn't conform to this kind of neoliberal money-making kind of crafting. 2 participants in Manchester shared the characteristics of the hipster knitter, we would say, but even that wasn't so straightforwardly, but no others really shared any characteristics of the hipster knitter or the trendy knitter at all. So the majority of our knitters knitted for pleasure, knitted privately, and they all emphasised the joy of doing that, joy of doing something that was creative and fulfilling. That was a really strong theme that came out. So just to emphasise the ideas of the everyday knitter being neither one of the 2 discourses that Catherine explored with you, is a quote from Emma. There used to be one kind of standard image of someone that knitted, which was this little old lady with blue rinsed hair. And now there's 2 standard images because you've got the hipsters and the knitting circles in trendy cafes. Well, I don't fit into either of these, and probably the majority of people who knit don't fit into either of those either. But it's still what people expect. So now we'll talk about, for the majority of the remainder of the talk, about what themes we did find within the interviews, the focus groups, the knitting circles that took place. We'll go through each of these in turn, but we found 4. That was the theme of domestic knitting, knit and matter hierarchies. I'll be interested in the audience's response to that when I talk about that. People found that their knitting was unfashionable, and the matrilineal leisure and the connection with female members of their family. So first, the theme of domestic knitting. We found that our knitters in general preferred to knit within their homes and were somewhat sceptical about this trend of public knitting. So Hazel, 69 from Manchester, says, there's certainly a lot of years when I wouldn't not be afraid but cautious about knitting in public because it was like only grandmothers knit and I was not a grandmother. So it's that stigma of knitting, preventing someone to feel comfortable in knitting publicly. Lorraine and Joan were from our Wrexham focus group and they tended to knit as a family, so they had certain nights of the week where they would come across and knit together. And they taught together. I don't think I'd want to. We're comfortable with where we are, what we do. And we've got our own little group and that's fine. We wouldn't enjoy that, would we? That means fencing publicly. Oh no, I don't think I'd want to do that. Lorraine carries on, we're a little bit staid, we're old, and I think it's a generational thing. We're quite happy doing what we do. We don't need to have anybody else in. We're all right the way we are. So Kirsty also from Chester talked about having a kind of stress about other people looking at their knitting and kind of judging it as well. When mentioning knitting in pubs, someone simply said, what a strange thing to do in a pub. That's Sarah, 35. Now, in contrast, Joanne said something slightly different about this. Joanne is 33, remember, so maybe part of the group that we want to get into, interested in knitting. She did knit in a knitting group in a pub. I quite like people being shocked when I say that I knit. I quite deliberately go out of my way to make people feel uncomfortable about it. And like knitting in public and people going, oh, you're not a granny, and oh, you're like, no, piss off. I quite enjoy that, like being aggressive with people about it. And I'm consciously trying to change what people think about knitters, like we're not all grannies. So that does actually fall into the kind of narrative of the hipster knitter dividing the granny knitters and separating themselves from that. So domestic knitting theme also identified that some of our knitters were not necessarily connected online. And when they were connected online, it was not necessarily in the way that we would imagine. So our Wrexham knitter again, Lorraine, 64, talked about how she bought something off eBay, and all of a sudden this neighbour delivered the yarn to her within the hour. I went to the door and she got this parcel in her hand and I said, hello. She said, have you ordered yarn off eBay? I said, yes. She said, well, I've bought it for you. I said, good grief, where have you come from? She said, the place, which was only just up the road. So this is a beautiful little example of being connected online with knitting, but it's still got this domestic, local feel to it. So saying that you're connected online doesn't necessarily mean that you're the hipster knitter, one might assume. So here we come to knit and natter hierarchies, one of my favourite themes. Many participants that we talked to identified a hierarchy within some of the knit and natter circles that they had experienced. Jane, 44, from Chester said, my friend always went to the Tuesday group and she said, come along, and that was fine. Then it got oversubscribed. And there was a hierarchy then. There was a decision as to who went every week. It's now a closed avenue to me. So it was almost the idea of, you know, it was the best ones that came and got selected to go. That took the joy out of it for Jane. But then she remembered when she was a nurse on night shifts and she knitted then as part of a group. That was everything, that was something they all did. But she felt like she had to knit then to fit in, so it wasn't like this joyous, open, inclusive kind of group. In relation to this carrying on, this is a beautiful conversation that went on between Sarah, Jane and Kate in the Chester focus groups. In the knitting circle, Sarah says, there were two circles, the one that was there and the one that wasn't. The inner and outer circle, someone else confirms, yes, so it wasn't very welcoming. I've thought about the idea of going to a knitting circle or something like that occasionally, but I must admit, the idea of there being a hierarchy of complexity or something like that would put me off. And Joanne thinks about knitting circles being an opportunity of shaming people for not supporting independent yarn makers and there being a hierarchy in that sense. You know. So the Wrexham focus group were very much into their cheap yarn from B&M bargains and home bargains, and sometimes some of the Manchester knitters had sourced their yarn from a trip to San Francisco or something, you know. And so there were definite differences between how you bought yarn, and this could come out in some of the knit and natter groups. But then we did have a kind of opposite feeling to that as well. Charlotte, who was 30, didn't really recognise the exclusivity of the groups, and she kind of conformed to hipster knitter in this in this particular excerpt. In my workplace there's a knitting group where it breaks down boundaries. Knitting's a great sort of leveller. You're talking about yarn and they're telling you that they've bought something in San Francisco or whatever. It's the new thing. Or they've got some really beautiful alpaca yarn and you're dead jealous and it just sort of works like social glue. Perhaps it works like social glue when you're part of that. Okay, and then back to
okay. All right. I'm going to go really fast now because we're running out of time. So if you want to know a bit more about these other themes, you can ask at the end. But basically we found that a lot of our knitters, particularly the older knitters, did not think of knitting as trendy or fashionable or modern or current. They thought it was unfashionable. So one of our participants, Kate, who was 47, was really self-conscious about her knitting. She very occasionally took knitting into work and knitted on her lunch break in her office. But she got really paranoid about people looking at her and thinking that that wasn't something that she should be doing. So she thought people were saying, what's she doing? She's supposed to be at work, she's knitting. And then she told us that she took this really personally. She could be quite upset by this. And she realised that, well, this is not what someone in my job is expected to do, or somebody that rides a bike or whatever is expected to do. So she thought her knitting was really at odds with her professional identity, her active sort of modern identity. In contrast, the younger participants were really gung-ho about being seen knitting. So Natalie in Wrexham, who was 28, just said, I'll do it at my desk, and if I'm staying in on my lunch, I'm not afraid to say, yeah, this is what I do. So she was really sort of in favour of showing off her knitting, and she wouldn't take any criticism about it. This idea that knitting was unfashionable seemed to transfer to the perception of knitted objects amongst the older knitters. So there's a nice quotation from Joan, who's 58 in Wrexham, who said, I don't know how it would be perceived now by the younger set, having all the stuff from TK Maxx, the shop, and then they'd have this little matinee coat from me, and they think, oh, it's just so old-fashioned. I don't think the young women, the young modern women, would actually appreciate a little matinee coat. So for Joan and Lorraine in Wrexham, they didn't sort of recognise the new cachet that the handmade has accrued. They still thought of hand-knitted objects as being outmoded, something that modern young women wouldn't appreciate. In terms of that theme we talked about of knitting being woke and politically active, our older knitters simply didn't talk about their knitting in that way. They did not consider it to be a political or feminist act. Yet when we spoke to them, a number of them knitted for charity. So they sort of made jumpers or blankets. They're involved in various sort of local charities, but they just didn't articulate it as being woke. They were unself-conscious about it. So Hazel, who was 69, said, I don't mind putting jumpers, cardigans, blankets in a box and sending them off to whoever. It's not for me to say where they're going to end up. So maybe we could interpret that as this kind of depoliticised older woman. But I think that belies the sort of commitment and the time and the resources that go into making things like blankets. Hazel obviously cared about the causes that she supported, but she was open-minded, right? So why isn't older women's charitable knitting hailed by the media as being woke, like younger women's Pussycats are? All right. Our participants reported a lot of benefits from knitting. We've not really got time to talk about those today. But the main one that we identified was the links that knitting gave them to family, female family members, and the idea of matrilineal craft. So craft that had been passed on from mother to daughter or grandma to granddaughter and so on. This was really important to them. So Lorraine said, it's extremely important, mainly because it's contact for me now with my sister and my niece. Initially it was with the granddaughters as well. Way back when I needed to do it was quite stressful. So she used to have to knit for necessity because knitting clothes for a family was cheaper than buying them. But now it was for leisure. So this was something that she could take real pleasure in now, knitting for leisure with other women, other generations of her family. And again, I won't read all these out, but these are examples of our participants just saying how wonderful it was to be taught by a mother, a grandmother, or how they had taught their own grandchildren, for instance. And there was a bit of a sad account because Beatrice, who was 58 in Manchester, she taught her granddaughter successfully to knit, but she wasn't able to teach her grandson because the grandson's father thought that knitting was girly and he didn't allow her to teach her grandson, and this was a source of regret for Beatrice. So people really valued that matrilineal skills transmission.
All right, you can say conclusion. Okay, so really quickly, although our study is quite small scale, we can conclude by saying that the majority of knitters are still women aged above 35, and they were very much aware of being derided as kind of grandma knitters, but they didn't necessarily experience knitting in the way that the younger new knitters were meant to be experiencing knitting. As a result of our study, we feel it's important to state that everyday knitters' experiences are no less valid or significant than the political knitters, the hipster knitters, so-called new knitters. They may diverge from new knitting in various different ways, but it's very important to look, study and find out more about women's traditional matrilineal leisure pursuits such as knitting. And we need to look more into the meaning and emotional bonds that knitting gives to women and others. So now I will just leave you with a lovely image of a grandma knitter not to be reckoned with. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, guys, and particularly thank you for dealing with those technological challenges during the talk. You will handle that very smoothly, so thanks. Can I just act as chair? Has anyone got any questions for either of our speakers? Yes?
Yeah, do I need to stand up?
You can do.
Sometimes people ask me to stand up when I'm already standing, but are you going to continue researching into knitting and or branching out into other women's crafts? Embroidery, I think, inhabits a very different place in political history.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think we'd like to stick with knitting actually, because I think there's a lot more that can be done about it, and some of those, even though we lumped them together a bit today as textile handicrafts, they do have quite different trajectories and different histories, and there's a lot of stuff we'd like to do. One of the things Cassie pointed out is all our participants were white, and one of the things we'd like to do is do more research with black knitters. So there's been work done that says it's a myth that black people don't knit. This apparently was said at a knitting conference. Somebody actually said black people don't knit, and that's been debunked, but we'd like to do more and see if there are any differences there. So knitting's a bit of a seam still to be mined before we move on to anything else.
Yes.
Vivian Rivis. I've knitted since I was about 5, I think, taught by my grandma, probably, can't remember. I'm trying to teach my grandson, who's 3, but he usually says, I'll get my combine, which means he winds the wool around the chute of his toy combine because he thinks somehow it's some sort of technical activity. Yeah. But I'll persevere. What I wanted to ask you was, did anything emerge about the impact of the knitting designer? I've knitted through the decades. The resurgence in the 80s was led often by male designers, and I've certainly been to a talk by one of them in the early 2000s when he made very disparaging remarks about people just like me, older women knitters, who had bought his expensive books and his expensive yarns and fabrics, and I kind of lost faith at that point. I think some of the women designers have been perhaps a close relationship with the kind of women you talked about, because they've employed a lot of knitters to test their patterns. And I wondered if that had come up at all in your research.
That's interesting. If I may just talk about a related anecdote, and then we'll get back to that. When we went to the knitting conference for the first time, we noticed there being different roles for males and females. So males were there, it was predominantly females, but the males who were there tended to be the designers and or the menders, the technical menders that might be making a lot of money out of knitting. So it just reminded me of that, and I think it's a really interesting question to ask. But we didn't really ask much about the patterns and the connections, although people did talk about the connections to other women when they recommended a pattern, etc., or they'd amended their own pattern. But that's a really interesting question that we could...
It might have been that we didn't really ask that question, if you like. We were thinking of knitting as an amateur hobby in the way we designed the focus groups, rather than asking those kind of questions. So we couldn't rule it out, but maybe...
I think it would lead to something fruitful, because certainly some of the revivals over the decades that I've taken part in have been linked to, for example, when Rowan was in its heyday before it was taken over, you know, that was a real hub of creativity, and all the designers wanted to use Rowan yarns. Right. So I think that there's something there that...
Thank you. It's something we might look into. Yeah,
thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Following on Kenny with Beckett, following on from the comments about black women don't knit, knitting is very popular in Africa, or certainly parts of it, and including public knitting. And when I used to live in Kenya, I was always amused by the signs on the public buses forbidding knitting. I think because they thought you might poke someone's eyes out.
Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't really know that. We've been told that a lot of knitting in the Black British community takes place around church groups. So we're thinking of trying to access some of those in future and talk to people there. But that's something for the future. So thank you.
Yes.
I've worked in Malawi very briefly 3 times in a children's home, and the mothers, if you take out wool, it can't go far enough because they want to knit or they want to crochet, and it'll come back 2 days later with something made absolutely pristine, and they live in the soil floored, whatever they've got, accommodation they've got, so they do knit and crochet.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a slightly more general question, but I was, you know, where you started off and you talked about the different crafts, obviously like sewing and you know, other textiles, quilting. But there's a resurgence, isn't there, of the idea of a making more generally, and knitting, although as the lady the other day said, it's had several of these revivals. At the moment it's part of that making. And I wondered why you think that's happening at this point in the 21st century, that we are doing, you know, we do seem to be sort of embracing this idea of going back to craft and making. Is it just a trend, or is it saying something about sort of social change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's loads of stuff being written about sort of neo-artisanal practices, and there's loads of theories about, it's been argued it's because since 9/11 we're living in uncertain geopolitical times, and people are returning to the home as a place of safety and sort of performing domestic crafts. It's been argued that second wave feminism promised women that they'd find fulfillment and, you know, and riches if they went out to work, but it turned out that was a lie. So women are returning to the home in either alongside their paid labour or separately to it. There's been an argument that it sustains austerity, so it's based in a kind of make, do, amend 1940s nostalgia that makes us think it's cool to count the pennies, and really this just sustains the economic cuts of the evil Tory government. So loads of things. We could talk about that all day, but we've probably not got time.
Yes.
Since time began, in historical novels, the women are always embroidering or knitting or doing something, all those novels all the way through. And I personally sit at home and I got to be doing something with my fingers. Don't you think there's something physical in the need to do it? Just playing in your fingers. So I think, all right, we persuade ourselves it's useful. I know in the later 50s it was, because it was cheaper to knit than it was to buy. But I also think now we don't need to, but we want to. And I think we want to fiddle with our fingers.
There's a lot of our participants talked about that, and how maybe it stops them from drinking or stops them from smoking. There was that sort of narrative that came through, but also that it gave them that they didn't know what to do if they weren't knitting when they sat down of an evening.
Made them feel that they weren't wasting their time. Some of them said they felt they could watch telly if they were knitting, because they were being productive at the same time.
That's it,
But that raises questions about why women don't feel that they can just lie on the couch doing nothing, because men don't have a problem doing that. Yeah, thank you, really interesting.
Yes.
I wanted to say first of all that I am 70, although I'm not unfortunately a grandma, and I really don't recognise the people I knit with in several knitting groups, in your description of your knitting groups of older women. And I wonder whether there's equally a divide, not so much by age, but within the people between the people who are involved in Ravelry and knitting magazines and so on. They're really interested in designers, as Viv was saying, who are mostly women, I have to say. There are men designers, but mostly women. And Ravelry has made a huge difference in the number of women who can make a living, designers who can make money from selling designs for knitting patterns on Ravelry. So that has had a huge impact on the way that knitting is carried on for some people. Now, I have a feeling that some of your older women knitters didn't have anything to do with any of that.
Yeah, some of them didn't.
They were maybe going to their local yarn shops and looking at the leaflets produced by Peyton's and these Sirdar and these other knitting companies, and not having anything to do with anything online.
Yeah. So it may have just, the sample, they came to us. Yeah. So it could be that we got, strangely, a particular set of people. There was a little bit more difference than maybe we've presented today. So we only spoke to 15 people, so we'd like to extend it and speak to more. But it's also interesting that those women that we're talking about are exactly the ones who haven't been studied. So there have been papers about women of different ages, mainly younger, who are socially networked and involved in all the things you've talked about. But that very type of older woman who doesn't do that is the kind of knitter that's been neglected. So we're sort of zooming in on that knitter for now, but it would be interesting exactly to do some more, cast our net a bit wider.
Which is why we want to stick with knitting for a bit, because we realise, we've just found the start of some interesting things and we'd like to explore that. So coming from North Wales myself, I think there'd be very different connections with knitting and knitting groups if I went to Anglesey and Bangor and then places, and how that is even experienced differently in Wrexham, which is more of an industrial or market town. And then Manchester, we always talk about the differences in different places and how knitting is understood and experienced quite differently. So we can access different groups. I think we need to access different groups and get a wider scope of understanding.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. That confirms some suspicions that we had.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'm just wondering if maybe we should finish it now, given time. But perhaps if anyone is interested to ask more questions, or maybe volunteer to be part of a group, if there's any further research taking place, and if you'd like to stay behind and talk to Cassie and Catherine, then please do, and we'll take your details, and you never know, you could be part of the next wave of research on knitting. So thanks very much everyone for coming, and again for putting up with a few technical problems, but let's give them one more clap.
Thank you.